Welcome to It's What Our Characters Would Do, the podcast where a neutral good ranger and a chaotic neutral warlock talk about RPGs, roll funny dice, and give away some sweet loot. I'm Bob World Builder. Oh yeah, Grace World Destroyer isn't here today, so it's just me doing an AMA, but we're still giving away a mystery dice set from Only Crits, and this is usually where I ask Grace how she's doing, so... Well, I'm doing okay. It's been a pretty weirdly not busy week, and I say that because I still did like the same amount of work I usually do, but for some reason I guess it was just a little smoother, and because I basically took a whole day off of work, it was like half a day, but it ended up being most of the day, to drive to Maryland for the final time, dropping off the keys at our old apartment office, because we're finally done with that place. We were on the lease for a little while here after we've moved to our new home in our good old home state of PA. But that's done, and that feels good. It feels good to finally be here for good. Nonetheless, to explain a little bit what's going on with this episode, essentially, choosing podcast topics is one of the most difficult things for some reason. Like, Grace and I both love doing this podcast because it's so easy. We get to just sit down, have a cool conversation together. We're rolling the dice. Like, we really enjoy it, and I hope that always translates through on each episode. But for some reason, deciding on a topic is always so hard. Not that it should be, because I feel like once we get going, we'll talk about anything. But just picking a topic that we both feel like we could ramble about for a little while is usually difficult. So I do want to establish probably a channel in the Discord. Maybe I'll do it right after this because I really should just do it. I'm going to create a channel about the podcast, or maybe for Bob's RPG Radio would be better, I suppose. But on a regular basis then, I guess on a monthly basis, I will make some kind of post, tag everybody, I suppose, and say, hey, suggest some podcast topics here. And then I would want people to just throw down reactions to whatever one they like the most. So then it's just, we are organically responding to what the community wants to hear about. I think that would be the best way, and it would kind of take that analysis paralysis decision making of choosing the topic off our hands, put it into the community's collective hands. And I don't know, this is becoming more of like a housekeeping bit of news about the podcast now, but that's okay, because we're here to just answer some questions. Why don't we get into our first segment, The Quick Build, where we try to summarize the topic/goal for this episode in 3d6 words or less. 11. Well, I already kind of told you what's going on for this one. Man, is it this off the rails already without Grace here? Is she secretly the chaotic one, but somehow keeping everything together? I don't know. 11 words. Let's see. Grace isn't here, so I'm just doing and ask me anything. Done. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And because I forgot to elaborate on it previously, Grace isn't here because choosing the podcast topic is for some reason this weird, difficult thing that I'm bad at doing. And then even when we got to this point where it's like, okay, we'll just talk about anything, whatever, the few remaining nights to record this podcast before it needs to go up on Patreon, Grace is either like in games, running games, had like a work thing going on. Like there's just a couple things happening that we couldn't get it done. Also, one of the cool things was we visited my old high school just last night to go to an art show, because now that we're back in the area, it's just a cool thing that I wanted to do. And, my high school art teacher is still there, and it was very cool seeing him again. He's very much the same man that he was 10 or 15 years ago, whatever it was that I was a student there. And I also was there to then drop off a couple of books, pretty much just the stuff that WotC gave me at the summit, donating it to their TTRPG club, which now exists and is super cool. And I wish it was there when I was there. But yeah, want to help them out when I can. So let's get into the actual questions now. Yeah, we're already like several minutes into this. Let's start rolling. And not to take that too literally, where we would usually roll to get these questions, I'm just going to go through pretty much all these here. There's only about 20 of them, so write down the list, starting with Camel X. I'd like to hear your opinion on experience leveling versus milestone. All my home games, we use milestone. I feel like it's way more satisfying than just getting levels at essentially random points. I agree. I never made a video about this because I think I am a little ambivalent about the topic, but I'll say that I guess in practice, I always use milestone. Only in my very first, the first campaign that I played in, we used experience points that I think was just combat based. However, everything about that game was like completely made up by our DM. So it was pretty much an arbitrary amount of XP that may as well have just equated to milestone anyway. When I took the reins for my first long-term campaign and happened to be using the D&D 5e system, I did use XP. And now, of course, XP mostly comes from combat, but I found some house rule on Reddit, I believe, that broke down just sort of a simple way of how to calculate, again, just numerical experience points for non-combat encounters, kind of based on what the challenge rating of the encounter would or should be, again, even though monsters may or may not be involved. And I used that for a while, but this was at a time where, besides my full-time job, I didn't have this channel yet. We don't have any kids or anything. So this game was my entire life outside of work. So I easily had the time to come up with these more or less arbitrary numbers and calculate XP that way. It was definitely time consuming. I just had the time on my hands, so I didn't mind it. But I'll say it did feel satisfying for me that way. And I do think generally with experience points, again, calculating actual points, it's rare that your characters are going to level up at a random time because they're usually going to get a huge load of those points after doing some arc-ending, big boss kind of encounter. And it all comes down to what you're tying those points to. I agree that whole hog combat XP is probably not the way to go because then it really does just force your characters, or I shouldn't say force, but encourage the players to just use their characters grinding away, fighting giant spiders in the forest or whatever if they want to level up. And for that reason, I do think milestone can just be smoother because you can just tie it to whatever plot points you want and whatever plot points are important to the players themselves. And if it helps to know this, I've actually run, I want to say 2 polls about this, each one with thousands and thousands of responses, and both times and every time I've seen this poll done by other channels, I always see 70 to 80% of people saying they use milestone, and then 20 or fewer percent of people saying that they use combat XP, gold for XP, or whatever other random methods exist. But milestone XP, or milestone leveling, is by far and away the majority popular way to do this because it is easy and smooth and feels satisfying when you want it to. You're always going to be leveling up at the right moment. From David Jennings, hi Bob, out of all the different systems you've played, is there anything they had in common that made them fun for you to play? If so, what would that be? So I'll preface by saying I haven't played a ton of different systems. Just literally in the last 2 months though, I've really expanded quickly. With some of them, it's just reading the systems. With others, it is playing them. With some of them, it's both. But regardless, having, now read or played somewhere between 10, 12-ish different systems, I think the one thing that, for me, they all have in common is that I really do just love me some D20 fantasy. When I've come across some games that rely more purely on D6s, I'm there's stuff I like about it. There's definitely pros to having a system that's D6 based or, dice pool kind of system. But it's just something about the swinginess of the D20, rolling that crit, rolling that natural one that really feels special. So mechanically, I really like that in a game. And then, as I said, fantasy is also just part of what drew me to role-playing games in the first place. My love for things like Elder Scrolls games, Legend of Zelda, Lord of the Rings, probably the underlying foundation of my love for fantasy. But even simple things like, for some reason, really loving the stories of Robin Hood as a kid. And, that idea of And that idea of medieval times and nobility and rebellion and all these cool things clashing together that can exist in a medieval fantasy style system, that's another big factor for me. Because I do like Call of Cthulhu. I'm probably going to be putting a Call of Cthulhu solo play video on this channel relatively soon. I'm going to be playing Monster of the Week pretty soon, which is more of a modern day, like you're a bunch of monster hunters kind of thing. And those are cool. These are cool games. Millions of people enjoy them, but I definitely like fantasy and D20. So that's a common element for me personally. This one is from Norris Vastrada. Have you played with any optional rules involving characters losing limbs/eyes/ears/ etc.? If so, what did you think of it? If not, would you give it a shot? Do you think it would be fun? So off the bat, I will preface this by saying it's kind of a touchy subject, because while in my home game group, no one present has been affected by the loss of limbs, eyes, ears, etc., but that is something to be aware of when discussing these things in general. But in my games so far, I've only dabbled with this a little bit. Specifically, what comes to mind is I had a tavern game, like a homebrew mini game, basically the stabbing a knife between your fingers as fast as you can kind of game. And one of the players who tried it got a natural 1, and then I had him roll a d6 to decide which finger got chopped off, and it ended up being his pinky. This was a big deal because he was an archer character. Fortunately for him, it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Pretty much any other finger would have been terrible, but it worked out okay. But my general opinion on this is, as long as it's cool with all your players, as always, pretty much as with any homebrew rule, you should do this, I think, because as much as people will go back and forth saying, hit points are not meat points, you're not actually getting stabbed, it's about the will to fight in combat, etc., etc. But, when you go to 0 hit points and you're unconscious, it's not because you just got really tired in combat. It's because you're getting the crap beat out of you. And so I do think that in this game where it's like 90% of the rules are about combat, and we love having all these exciting new rules for combat and weapons, etc., we should absolutely have rules, again, as long as it's cool with all your players, we should have rules that establish consequences for these combats. Because truthfully, there's no consequences for most combats in a system where your characters can get knocked down and get right back up, or get knocked down and then wake up the next day fully healed. That's just kind of silly, or at least I've come to not like it very much. With so little risk, there ends up being so little opportunity for reward, If you always come out of combat unscathed, it doesn't feel dangerous. And if it doesn't feel dangerous, it doesn't feel exciting, at least for me. So I'm probably going to introduce some kind of house rule with either critical hits or natural 1s, but not both, and have to make sure it's done in a way that doesn't mean martial characters are always going to be having this done to them, but spellcasters aren't. And I'll say this is easier to incorporate in the new system I'm using at my table, Dungeon Crawl Classics, because both spellcasters and martial characters have to roll for pretty much everything. So in summation, yes, I think it would be fun, but it's super important to discuss this topic with your players before you want to introduce it. Because you could end up making somebody really uncomfortable, or it could just be a thing that they don't find fun for whatever reason, and you don't want to impose not fun rules on your players. This one's from J. Kevin Carrier. In the first edition DMG, Gary Gygax included Appendix N, a list of fantasy authors who had inspired him, including Paul Anderson, Robert E. Howard, Michael Moorcock, et al. As a DM, what authors, would be in my Appendix N? Okay. I have to start with Tolkien, which I feel like is probably at the top of the list for Gygax. If it wasn't, it should be, because obviously 80% of D&D is just ripped out of Tolkien. Obviously embellished with higher fantasy elements, especially as D&D progressed. But I, in a way, stick truer to Tolkien in that I really prefer my settings and my magic to be lower, and to be lower fantasy and more mysterious magic is where I was going with that thought. I'd kind of also have to say Lovecraft, which I know is part of Appendix N, and that's just because I really discovered Lovecraft's work around the same time that I was getting into D&D. So for me, they're just kind of bound together. I don't actually include a ton of Lovecraftian elements in my games, I think. It's honestly a pretty broad term. Like, does that just mean tentacles, or does that mean weird aliens in the Antarctic? Lovecraftian is a very broad term. But he would have to be on my list in some respect. And then off the top of my head, I think the one other book that I've read over and over in my life is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And it's actually been several years since I've read it, but I've read that book at least 6 times. It was something I had to read, I think, maybe in 8th grade, or maybe it was early on in high school. And then I read it almost probably every other year, all through high school and college, just because it was a quick read. I really enjoyed his prose, to not sound too much pretentious or anything here. But I really do like the way the book reads. The story just makes me feel emotions every time I read it. And of course, it does have a cool film adaptation featuring Viggo Mortensen. But for those who don't know, The Road is basically a modern-ish post-apocalyptic story that just follows a father and son, who I'm 99% sure are both unnamed characters throughout the whole book, basically traveling, I think, from the no, they're going south. They're going from somewhere in like the northeast U.S. to somewhere in the southeast U.S. before winter. And they do run into some stereotypical post-apocalyptic fantasy stuff, like cannibals is kind of one of the main issues they run into. But this is nothing like Mad Max post-apocalyptic fantasy. This is very down-to-earth and still gritty, but also just very heartfelt. Like, I pretty much do cry every time I read this book. So that would, in some way, even though it is not fun at all, some way this does influence what I do with D&D. I would have to say it does, because it's just, again, a pervasive book always in the back of my mind, somewhere down there. So that would have to be on my list. Next one from the What If Brigade. What was your favorite rule of cool moment for a character, and how would rules as written have changed the moment? Yeesh. That's really hard for me to answer, because honestly, when I GM, I feel like I rule of cool a lot of things. I don't know. I guess I truly am a rulings over rules GM, because that's, I will say that's how I was raised, but no, it's how I've always played D&D. For my very first campaign, as I mentioned earlier, my DM just kind of made everything up. And it was always just about, maximizing the fun within some bounds of realism. I actually have a more reined-in style than my original DM, but regardless, I'm very willing at the table to not look a rule up in favor of just deciding what would be cool and still having to roll for it, not just letting anything fly. Like I said, I'm a little more grounded, but that's why it's so hard to pick a favorite, because it's like so many things per session could probably be ascribed to rule of cool. I guess one thing off the top of my head would have to be during a Patreon game, when one of the characters who was playing a arcane trickster rogue tabaxi, because this was a 5e game, in our sort of post-apocalyptic Arctic style, tundra setting, wanted to basically launch themselves across some large distance and into basically one of the infernal war machines from Baldur's Gate setting, 5e book. It wasn't obviously quite like that, because we were playing this in our own homebrew setting that was kind of Icewind Dale-esque, just in terms of the climate at least. But regardless, there were Dwergar who used these sort of vehicles, and she wanted to just rocket her tabaxi into one. And as you may know, tabaxi have, I want to say, a higher moving speed, but they definitely have a feature that lets them like double dash or something crazy. And she had some items at her disposal. And I'm pretty sure this character, or this player, had a hero point awarded to them that they could dish out at any moment to, either boost a roll or re-roll, or again, just kind of allow a sort of rule of cool moment. So this player pulled out all the stops and wanted to launch themselves across some great distance into this vehicle and knock out the driver. And because they were pulling out all the stops to make this happen, I was like, well, we're still going to roll for it. They rolled for it. I don't remember what they got, but it was high enough that it worked. And that sort of thing, again, with a tabaxi, maybe actually could happen because the movement speed just gets ridiculous with some of these player races in 5e, and the abilities and spells and stuff you can stack on top of it. But yeah, it worked, and it was very cool. And if we did that rules as written, it might have worked, but it wouldn't have been as cool because we would have spent like 30 minutes doing all the math. It's just ridiculous. All right. And doing a podcast alone is hard because it's just me talking for, on my time, already like 25 minutes straight here. So I'm going to take a little break, and then we're going to get back and burn through the rest of these questions. Heck yeah. Now I know why Grace often drinks a tea during or before we do this because, yeah, I was drinking like cool water, and I should have known better. It's like I'm the one who records videos all the time. But yeah, I actually recorded a video shortly before starting this episode as well. So voice, definitely feeling it. But I just got myself a classic Bob mug of hot water with honey in it because who has time to actually wait for tea to do whatever it does? And we're just going to start rolling again. From TDA, big fan of your style and content. What's your opinion on virtual theater of the mind for D&D games? Virtual theater of the mind. Okay, I assume they mean using theater of the mind while you are playing remotely, because I guess people usually reference theater of the mind for an in-person game, versus a grid. But yeah, just theater of the mind instead of using an actual virtual tabletop. Okay. In short, I think that's fine. That's actually my preferred way of playing D&D remotely because, yeah, using a virtual tabletop, it's just, I don't know. I personally would just spend way too much time fine-tuning maps and things, or looking for the perfect map or the perfect tokens, and then, okay, where should they be? The game just slows down so much when you use a grid, and I get that it can be helpful, but in my games, we still use visual aids, but generally I would prefer it to be something just without a grid, even if it's a blank sheet of, a Google slide. It's like what I've done before, and then we're just drawing on it together. That just works better for my style during a game. That said, probably 90% of the games I've run remotely, I have used a virtual tabletop whenever we did combat, just because it's more typical, I guess. But yeah, most of those games were with patrons, and and I think just because that's kind of an expectation, and I wanted to present a bit of a more professional setup in that context. I mean, when I'm literally professionally GMing, then yeah, I find it important to put in that time to get the maps, get the images. But generally speaking, I prefer to not do any of that because it's that same kind of principle. What's it called? The Pareto principle, 80-20, right? Your game is going to be 80% of the way there fun, just you GMing it. Adding those extra maps, the grid, the tokens, maybe that's going to enhance it a couple more percent points of fun. But is it worth all the time that just this one person, right, the GM has to put into it? Not for me personally, anyway. And now I have a cat on my lap because she just started making noise. But anyway, from Samuel Tier, what is one thing, rule, lore, option that you think D&D has that other systems should also include? And the inverse, what is something that D&D is missing that other systems have? That's a really good question. I can do the second one very easily and say that D&D is missing a luck stat. That's one of my favorite parts of DCC, not only making the luck rolls, because anytime, well, first of all, DCC doesn't have a ton of, cat off my lap, D&D does not have a ton of character skills to use. You roll a check for strength, dex, con, or I should really say strength, agility, stamina, etc. But you don't have a list of skills that then each have their bonuses unless you're a thief class, and then your character does have a list of special skills that they get to use. But what I'm getting at is in D&D, even with this list of, 20 different skills, it still comes up way too often for me, where I just don't know, there is no skill that fits for whatever the character is trying to do, or nothing that fits closely enough. And then I have to really think about it and try to pick one, and then maybe mix and match the ability score and the skill that they're rolling, right? But in DCC, it's so much easier to just say, roll luck. It's literally just going to come down to whether or not your character is lucky right now. And one thing is that other systems do have this, where you would roll a d6. 1, 2, 3, yes. 4, 5, 6, no. So it could be that simple, but what's neat about having the luck stat means that your character, by virtue of birth or luck of their own birth, whatever, that character might be lucky. So they might have a bonus to their luck rolls, or they might be unlucky and have a negative to their luck rolls. So there's actually something influencing this luck roll, and I think that's really unique. And next time I run a game of D&D 5e, I'm probably going to include that to some capacity. And then other things that maybe D&D has that another system should have, I would kind of just have to say the amount of third-party publications. D&D, because it has absorbed probably 90% of the TTRPG market, right? Everybody is creating and publishing stuff for this game. And there's still tons of people publishing stuff for games like DCC, but the amount of stuff out there and the quality of stuff is definitely better for D&D because there's more competition, because people have been doing it for 50 years. And it'll just be cool to me when that sort of community, that ecosystem around the game starts to exist for other games, or there's just more of a propensity, is that the word I'm looking for? Just more of a push to create system neutral stuff that people can use for any D20 fantasy system. That would be great. All right, this next one from Marshall Waters seems to be asking a similar question to the Appendix N1, basically saying, what are pieces of media and video games that have influenced, my style and my games? So, like I said before, definitely Lord of the Rings, probably at the foundation. Definitely some classic Robin Hood. But beyond those stories, a lot of it does come down to video games for me. There's a game that, this might be a deep cut for some people, a pair of games that were on PlayStation 2 called Champions of Norath and Champions Return to Arms that when I was a kid, I played this with, the guy, my best friend, who then became my first DM. And little did we know, these games were heavily inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. And then this only progressed further with Elder Scrolls Oblivion, which that same friend also introduced me to. So really, I owe a lot of it to this friend for keeping me on the track of fantasy and then introducing me to D&D. And I should really get him on the podcast one of these days. But those games, and then, like I said, Elder Scrolls games, for me also, Legend of Zelda definitely comes into play here. And it's funny because in a way, what this means is that a lot of the games that influenced me were themselves created and influenced heavily by older editions of D&D. So maybe that's, in a way, why now going back to more quote-unquote old school games or ideas in the game of D&D and RPGs feels more natural to me. Okay, and at this point, I feel like I'm almost definitely not going to answer all these questions, so I'm going to try to do a couple real quick. From Will Milan. This is such a good question, though. How has being an environmental educator influenced your games? Much like your IRL series, are there natural world/biology aspects that trip you up? Mine is a wild-shaped druid reptile swimming in cold water. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of hit it right on the head there. Something that trips me up for sure is how dragonborn and lizard folk and there's definitely another reptile folk out there, but that these guys can just live in any old climate and it's not a big deal. Definitely annoyed by the existence of some other weird funky races like Loxodon and whatever the hippo one is, because I'm pretty sure they end up having hands with fingers on them, and that's just kind of weird to me. Like, if you're going to Elephant Man, be an Elephant Man. You need to respect the idea that you don't have opposable thumbs. But at the same time, then how would that creature ever have gained any intelligence? Because for those of you who may have studied Earth history in the past, thumbs are a big deal for why humans were able to essentially evolve and become intelligent. And I guess to go back a little further there, he asked about me being an environmental educator. Really, that is just a product of the fact that I did study environmental science in college my whole time and also even got a master's in it. And while biology was not the big topic for me, I really was more of a forest ecology student, especially as a grad student. One of the big ones for me is the nonsensical biology of dragons having 4 legs rear legs, and a pair of wings. That doesn't work. Every freaking creature with bones, with a skeleton, has 4 limbs, plus a head, and then maybe a tail, because that's part of the spine. But you can't have somebody with legs, arms, and wings. Not happening. That's why even in a bunch of my games, any bird folk, like, you did not have legs, arms, and wings. You had legs, and then your arms were wings. And the convenient thing is that also takes care of the, quote unquote problems of, level 1 characters being able to fly and whatever, because it turns out you can't actually fly and shoot a bow at the same time. And I guess real quick, just the lack of crafting and harvesting rules in D&D. Oh, that's a big, oh yeah, that's a huge thing that D&D is missing, to go back to the previous question. I don't, not that DCC has that in particular, but I'm sure there's got to be other games that have that. That really needs to be something that I look for more going forward, because that's another part of what in my original game we homebrewed and used. We had different plants that we were looking for, and honestly, this was probably me as a player pushing for a lot of this. I don't think it was on my DM's radar to incorporate much of this. But I can speak for the whole group and say the first time we killed a dragon, you better believe we were tearing that thing up for scales and claws and horns and teeth and anything we could use, right? That's a big thing missing from the game. And it doesn't sound like they're putting in 1D&D, which is so weird. It's so weird. Another question from Mr. Defacia. What was your most memorable encounter with a cursed item? Really thinking here. Well, I can't say it's the most memorable, but I guess it technically is, because it's kind of the only one coming to mind right now, is when in my Icewind Dale campaign, one of my players, actually one of the characters played by my friend Dan, who I've mentioned here a bunch of times, looted a bunch of items. I think multiple of these items were cursed. This was like from a tomb somewhere in Icewind Dale. I don't remember the specifics. And the curse basically just gave him a level of exhaustion per day. So he was dying, and they had to quickly find some way to heal him, and it ended up working out. But it was just, went from like 0 to 100 real quick, and definitely a memorable one. Peter Gamble asks, hey Bob, a question and story about using a DM screen or not. Oh boy. So I've just recently started DMing a game for some friends in person. It's been a blast, but there has been a slight problem with my combat encounters. My monsters can't hit dang squat. I've been rolling openly in front of the players and just consistently getting below 10 numbers. It has turned attention way down because the PCs are mopping up the foes with ease. Do you recommend using a DM screen in general, and especially for the ability to fudge some low rolls, or do I embrace the fact that the dice are part of the storytelling? I mean, very easily, you don't need a DM screen, you need new dice. It sounds like for some reason. Again, maybe if you've used these dice for a long time and only now are they giving you issues, then it's probably just more in your head. But yeah, it's the rolls that are the problem. You can't be faking half your rolls to make it fair, right? If you're always rolling below 10, you're not going to fake rolling above 10 half the time. That's ridiculous. So, fudging in general, I think can be overblown. I think it can be okay. But generally speaking, rolling open is more fun, going with the dice. For me, it's more fun, and I recommend it for others as well. From Logan Kuntz, I have a few players in my group who have interest in crafting weapons, armor, potions, and various other items. How do you handle crafting, and what are some ways to make it fun and engaging without bogging down the session? So I'll throw out the best resource that I've found for this is the Monster Loot series of PDFs available on the DM's Guild. I even have a video about this, so if you want something more system neutral, unfortunately, I don't know an option right now. But with your question also asking how do you make it fun and engaging without bogging down the session, I think you probably don't want a resource for this. I think you do just need to hand wave and homebrew a lot of it. That's what makes the game fast. It just comes down to hashing it out with the player. What do they want? Okay, is it reasonable? Okay, how do we make it work? You just have to hand wave a lot of it, but lean on the rules that already exist in the game to achieve the desired effects of what they're going for, what they're trying to craft. It's the Dalton asks, how many races/ancestries do you think is too many in a game? Well, I can definitely say that the 30 plus races, I'm pretty sure it's 30 plus without even including sub-races in D&D 5e, is too many. When you get to the point of elephant men and hippopotamus Imperial British uniform wearing characters in your game. Yeah. And again, this is coming from a general fantasy setting. When you reach that point, you have absolutely crossed a line somewhere. You have gone too far. Personally, I'm really enjoying the reined-in nature of just humans, dwarves, elves, and halflings as playable races again. Obviously, I'm biased because, as I've said a couple times now, my foundation in fantasy is the Lord of the Rings. That's the major characters right there. Humans, dwarves, elves, and halflings. So, that's me. Ron Wingrove asks, Grace often talks about her campaign. Is she the ever DM between you? What differences are there between your DM style? No, we both DM and we both play. And currently we're not in a campaign together, funny enough. But yeah, so it's super rare that we get to play together because usually one of us is the DM. But the game she's DMing is just not a game that I'm in right now anyway. And as far as differences between our style, going back to what I said earlier, how my original DM was extremely loosey-goosey, and I still love to play in this guy's games, by the way. I reined it in a little bit. Grace is even more reined in than I, and leans more on the rules in the book. She's more willing to look something up, whereas I'm more like, let's keep the flow going here, and I just want to, make something up. And most of my friends, because they don't read the books, they're just very casual players, they just go along with it. So we have that great rapport, great balance at our table where we just, talk it out. Maybe there's a little bickering sometimes every once in a while, but it's all in good fun to figure out what's going to work or not work, or how extreme the role should need to be to achieve whatever. And we just go for it. But yeah, in Grace's game, there can be a little more pausing to look that stuff up, and I'm not trying to rag on it. It's a perfectly valid style of DMing, and ultimately ends up leading to some more satisfying wins sometimes. Because when you can achieve victory within the rules, it often feels very, very sweet, when something just works out. Another one about Grace from SE. Because she has loosened her grip upon our world for a fleeting, merciful moment, can you share what Grace World Destroyer's greatest weakness is? Is it cheeseburgers or pizza or heaps of Ben & Jerry's ice cream? The fate of the world may depend on it. Also, what is your greatest weakness? Well, considering all these are foods mentioned here, I'll just say that mine is definitely pizza. I've said it before, well, probably not on the podcast, but the only time I won't accept a piece of pizza is if I've just eaten 4 slices of pizza. Other than that, I can't say no. Grace's weakness? Probably just chocolate. Probably something like that. Or no, what am I saying? It's definitely ice cream. Literally, the joke is when we do have the opportunity to get ice cream, again, much like maybe the random opportunity that might come up that I get pizza, oh man, ice cream. We got to fill the tank. That's the joke, that she has some kind of ice cream tank that needs to be replenished every once in a while. Okay, DM Lindbergh Baby has 2 questions, and I'm just gonna, I guess I'll read them both real quick. What are real-life survival checks you have rolled? So for me, again, touching back on the environmental educator kind of background and environmental science background, honestly, just for a long time, I could not go outside without just staring around at different trees and, figuring out either quickly off the top of my head, because that, I got very good at it, or doing a little quick research there out in the field to just be like, what species of tree is this? Anyway, so that's probably the most of my survival checks, just for fun, identifying plants. But it's been a long time since I've done that. The more and more that D&D has taken over my career and life, the less and less I've been getting outside. So really need to incorporate that into my schedule more often. And the other one from DM Lindbergh Baby, what songs do you wish you had the rights to play on your channel? That's a really cool question. But what immediately comes to mind is how, all the bands that I listen to, probably like most of the bands you listen to, there's a vocalist. And songs with vocals don't make good songs to play in the background of a video where 90% of it is just a person talking. So honestly, there's very few. I guess I would have to say, not thinking of particular songs, but I do wish the YouTube audio library, where I get most of my music from, offered more options for good lo-fi music and good acoustic guitar. Let's keep it rolling. Oh my gosh, wait, no, we're on the last 2 questions already. So from G. Van Boeven, Can you talk about diversity, inclusion, and representation in your games? Do you make a point to include those elements? Do you think it happens organically in your sessions, or they don't play a big part of your games? So in my home games, the settings that I use, again, like homebrew style settings, are generally leaning heavy on just like European medieval fantasy, as I've belabored as a point during this session, very Tolkien-esque. But I guess unlike Tolkien's works, you could say that my games do in fact pass the Bechdel test. There are in fact female characters who do more than just talk about other guys. And I will say, like, there was a point where, during prep, I would always make a point to establish NPCs that I was creating as women or as people of color, because off the top of my head, like when I'm in the pressure in the moment, I can barely come up with a name, let alone come up with a respectful way to describe the person that I want to describe. Now it's more natural, just as I've gotten more comfortable giving descriptions quickly. And then the final question from Rooster's Place is actually just a request. Please create Grace the Destroyer as a level 20 BBEG. And, not just because we're at the end of the show, but nah, I'm definitely not going to do that. I don't think I've ever made a monster designed to be fought by level 20 characters, because level 20 is just, oh man, is it worth anything? I don't know. I've never even done like a one shot at level 20, not once. Maybe someday, but today is not that day. I need to drink some more hot water and rest my voice. But for sharing, maybe my favorite question, we have Peter Gamble, who absolutely needs some new dice so he can keep rolling in the open. So you are going home with a mystery set of dice from Only Crits. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and honk that like button. Wow, that's a weird one we put on the list. Anyway, honk that like button. And to be eligible for loot and support this show, consider subscribing or joining Patreon through the links below. Patreons also get a private RSS link to listen through your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for your support, and keep building. Oh my gosh, and she's not here to say stop building. Ha! Nice.